Bonsoir à tous, bien merci beaucoup d'être là, puisque nous avons le plaisir de recevoir ce soir Rachel Kushner, qui nous vient de Californie pour nous parler de son dernier roman Creation Lake, le lac de la création, qui vient de paraître en français, et évidemment de toute son œuvre. Alors, Rachel Kushner nous est connue pour 4 romans. Il y a eu le Telex de Cuba en 2008, Les Lance-Flammes, qui l'ont fait particulièrement connaître en France en 2014, et ici, le Mars Club, et donc aujourd'hui le lac de la création. Moi, j'avais été particulièrement marquée par Les Lance-Flammes, son deuxième roman, qui avait vraiment été la découverte d'une romancière hors norme. Elle racontait l'histoire d'une motarde, passionnée par l'Europe, aussi alerte sur la vie intellectuelle italienne des années 70 que sur l'Amérique contemporaine. Et puis, elle décrivait l'Italie des années de plomb et l'apprentissage d'une artiste en quête de radicalité. Aujourd'hui, avec le lac de la création, Rachel Kushner, une nouvelle fois, nous livre un roman qui relève autant du roman européen réflexif que du roman américain contemporain. Le lac de la création, c'est une œuvre virtuose. C'est à la fois un roman philosophique, un roman d'espionnage et un roman politique. Nul hasard donc qu'elle a eu un très beau succès aux États-Unis où il est sorti
no fluke that it was shortlisted in the US where it came out some months ago for the Booker Prize and the National Book Award, given the subtle touch with which it addresses contemporary issues. It's impossible to really situate this book that plunges us into the ultra-left movement in France in the Southwest. This is a community that resembles the Tarnac group led by Julien Coupat. You may remember this group. In 2007, the Tarnac case was on everyone's mind. They had been accused of sabotaging the SNCF's train lines, and the press were talking about it. I know that you were in contact with this group, Rachel, and followed their case. These militants that she described in Creation Lake are not accused of attacking the train lines, but are militating against a phenomenon which is closer to our concerns today, mega basins. How can we fight water mismanagement and misuse and the exploitation of nature? This is at the center of the book and at the center of the group's concerns. And this simple question opens broader philosophical, moral, and poetic perspectives. As Rachel Kushner describes the underground and the caves of this part of rural France, the Périgord, with a high level of knowledge and a very romantic style. She invents a character who tells us all this, Bruno Lacombe, a philosopher, a thinker, who knew Debord and decided to go live in a cave and sends long emails to the commune that he founded on the history of humanity and the future of human society. The action is narrated by Sadie. As I told you, this is a spy novel. Sadie is, in fact, an American spy. She's an FBI agent, but she's working for a private client here, and her aim is to incite this commune, Bruno Lacombe's commune, to commit a terrorist act against the police. So the novel plays out between suspense, spy novel, and the philosophical philosophical novel through Bruno Lacombe's thinking and about politics. What is politics in Europe and in the world today? Perhaps we could ask Rachel Kushner to read the beginning of the book.
Voilà, on l'écoute et ça va être traduit. Merci.
Thank you, Oriane. Thank you for summarizing the narrative for those who haven't read the book. I should just bring you with me everywhere I go. It's a perfect summary. I'm just going to read the first 3 pages so you get some of the tone. Thank you all for coming also. It's funny how Swiss people are so exacting and tidy. Nothing makes me feel so disorganized like being in Switzerland, but I'm also very happy to be here. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. Although it was likely, he said, that these noble and mysterious talls, as he sometimes referred to the Neanderthals, extracted nicotine from the tobacco plant by a cruder method, such as by chewing its leaves, before that critical point of inflection in the history of the world, when the first man touched the first tobacco leaf to the first fire. Reading this part of Bruno's email, scanning from man to touch to leaf to fire, I pictured a 1950s Greek. See, I told you. I pictured a 1950s greaser in a white t-shirt and a black leather jacket as he touches his lit match to the tip of his Camel cigarette and inhales. The greaser leans against a wall because that is what greasers do. They lean and loiter, and then he exhales. Bruno Lacombe told Pascal in these emails I was secretly reading that the Neanderthals had very large brains, or at least their skulls were very large, and we can safely infer that their skulls were likely filled, Bruno said, with brains. He talked about the impressive size of a tall's brain case using modern metaphors, comparing them to motorcycle engines, which were also measured, he noted, for their displacement. Of all the human-like species who stood up on 2 feet, who roamed the earth for the last 1 million years, Bruno said that the Neanderthal's brain case was way out in front at a whopping 1,800 cubic centimeters. I pictured a king of the road way out in front. I saw his leather vest, his big gut, legs extended, boots resting on chromed forward-mounted foot pegs. His chopper is fitted with ape hangers that he can barely reach, and which he pretends are not making his arms tired, are not causing terrible shooting pains to his lumbar region. We know from their skulls, Bruno said, that Neanderthals had enormous faces. I pictured Joan Crawford, that scale of face, dramatic, brutal, compelling. And thereafter, in the Natural History Museum in my mind, the one I was creating as I read Bruno's emails, its dioramas populated by figures in loincloths with yellow teeth and matted hair. All these ancient people Bruno described, the men too, they all had Joan Crawford's face. They had her fair skin and her flaming red hair. A propensity for red hair, Bruno said, had been identified as a genetic trait of the tall as scientific advancements in gene mapping were made. And beyond such work, such proof, Bruno said, we might employ our natural intuition to suppose that, like typical redheads, the Neanderthals' emotions were strong and acute, spanning the heights and depths. A few more things Bruno wrote to Pascal that we now know about Neanderthals. They were good at math. They did not enjoy crowds. They had strong stomachs and were not especially prone to ulcers, but their diet of constant barbecue did its damage, as it would to any gut. They were extra vulnerable to tooth decay and gum disease, and they had overdeveloped jaws, wonderfully capable of chewing gristle and cartilage, but inefficient for softer fare, a jaw that was overkill. Bruno described the jaw of the Neanderthal as a feature of pathos for its overdevelopment, the burden of a square jaw. He talked about sunk costs as if the body were a capital investment, a fixed investment, the parts of the body like machines bolted to a factory floor, equipment that had been purchased and could not be resold. The Neanderthal jaw was a sunk cost. Still, the tall's heavy bones and sturdy, heat-conserving build were to be admired, Bruno said, especially compared to the breadstick limbs of modern man, Homo sapiens sapien. Bruno did not say breadstick, but since I was translating, as he was writing these emails in French, I drew from the full breadth of English, a wildly superior language, and my native tongue. The talls survived cold very well, he said, if not the eons, or so the story about them goes, a story that we must complicate, he said, if we are to know the truth about the ancient past, if we are to glimpse the truth about this world now and how to live in it, how to occupy the present and where to go tomorrow. My own tomorrow was thoroughly planned out. I would be meeting Pascal Balmy, leader of Le Moulin, to whom these emails from Bruno Lacombe were written, and I didn't need the Neanderthal's help on where to go. Pascal Balmy said to go to the Café de la Route on the main square in the little village of Vantôme, and that was where I would be. So that's the first chapter, all right? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Why did you choose to begin with Bruno Lacombe's voice?
Well, you know, sometimes you just make a decision by strong instinct. I think that for me as a writer, when I'm preparing to actually execute the novel sentence by sentence, it's many years after looking at it from every angle and thinking about my material and trying to figure out what the engine of the material is. You can know a lot of things about a place, like I know a lot of things about France, and I can talk about those in an event, and I can talk about some of the precipitating, inciting incidents, like having seen, you know, a disgraced FBI agent who had entrapped somebody who was a friend of a friend who then went to prison. Like, I can know the natural physical world of the place, but to actually turn something into, sorry to say, but the magic of art, I have to find the correct method by which nothing is arbitrary any longer. And I was thinking about this character, Bruno, and I had an image of him as a man who has rejected civilization, who is living in a cave, because I'd heard about somebody in France who is a philosopher, who is a kind of anti-civilization thinker, who supposedly does live in a cave. I had an image of this man putting his ear to the rock wall of his cave and thinking that he hears like radio transmissions, the sound of the voices of people from different eras and epochs coming through to occupy one plane of reality, as if his cave is the entrance to a total escape from the strictures of calendar time. And I developed his character from that image. And I knew right away that the first line of the book would be, Les Néandertals étaient sujets à la dépression, disait-il. Did I say that right? And from there, it would be, he said, he told them, he said. So I knew that it was a woman who was interpolating his voice, but I didn't know right away much about her character. But he's the heart of the book, and so it had to begin with him.
Mm. It's very unusual for an American writer to set a novel in France. Would you explain how you decided to write about France, and what is maybe your special relation you have with French?
Yeah, sure. This book, like people have asked me, why did you choose to set this book in France? And it isn't as though there is a book that can be disarticulated from the environment in which it's set. It's very much about an atmosphere that is a French atmosphere, and about a rural region where you can feel this sense of the undulations of history. Almost like, you know, when you take a path that's near a limestone overhang, the air feels colder. It's like not temperature, but a feeling of the undulation of history. And I'm interested in, I guess, a phenomenon whereby young people decamp from Paris to a rural area and try to escape the confines of their bourgeois life and develop an understanding of living in nature and develop relationships to the local farmers, and try to understand what the challenges of farming are today in the European Union for a French farmer in the central Southwest. It's not an easy life. And there's like a long history of this. It's like you mentioned Tarnac recently, and also Notre-Dame-des-Landes in the Northwest. And then in the 1970s, a lot of people who were shaped by what happened in Paris in May of 1968 became very disillusioned. Like, it turned out that the factory worker was not really a revolutionary subject and just wanted to find their small share of the market economy. And so a lot of people on the ultra-left moved to the countryside almost by this like Maoist principle of dismounting from your horse and smelling the flowers, which means like staying in one place for a long time and learning to understand the very special fortitude of resistance that is, you know, almost like coming out of the ground in these places. That's also not an easy life for somebody, an educated person from Paris, to learn how to live in the countryside. And so there was a lot of failure with that. And I guess I'm just familiar with that history. I spend a lot of time in rural France and in the particular region where I set this book. But it deals with other things as well. As you mentioned, Guy Debord. I mean, I'm a child of French cinema in my own way. And Guy Debord is not really a classical part of cinema, but he's important to people in the art world, I would say, in the United States. And by proximity to the person I live with, my husband, I sort of have access to a certain political and philosophical history of France, because my husband is a kind of Francophile who was a student of Jacques Derrida, and now he's a translator for Alain Badiou, and he translated a book by the Invisible Committee called Introduction to Civil War. And so I've been to Tarnac, I've been to some other places, and I know a lot of people on the ultra-left, and watched as these people were infiltrated by an undercover agent who was British, and it was an incredible story, and it exploded into this enormous scandal and problem for the British press, and I knew people who were infiltrated by him. So it was like two things: proximity to a great story with dramatic tension that occurs in France, and also access to make inquiries among the people who were duped by this person. Like, this guy's name is Mark Kennedy, and he had infiltrated German climate activists. And when he was with them, he kind of looked like them. He was a white guy with, I mean, he stayed white, but he was a white guy with dreadlocks, wearing sort of like Guatemalan surf pants, so it's quasi-hippie looking. And then we started hanging out with the French kind of ultra-left anarchists, people who are very shaped by the anti-globalization movement in the early 2000s. He was clean cut, he dressed in black like they did. He looked, you know, a lot different. And I said, didn't you guys notice that he completely changed his look? And they said, you know, we thought he was just like coming to his senses, like finally, you know.
Maybe a question about your process of writing. Do you choose at first a topic, or is it a question that you're obsessed with?
I can be quite rash in a way. When I finish a novel, I decide my next novel is going to be about X, you know? And so very broadly, I choose a topic. But I would say I choose a world rather than a topic. And that world can be a temporal world, you know, a moment in time. It can be a geographical world. It can be a world of sentiment. And when I finished writing my last novel, The Mars Room, which I consider like, it's my take on contemporary times, like what it's like to live in California. And as a Californian, I hadn't written a contemporary novel yet. When I finished that book, I knew that I would turn to this question of betrayal to some degree, I would say, and also the question of whether one can escape our reality. My character, Bruno, has written a book called This World We Must Leave, or Leaving the World Behind. Sorry, so he's kind of inspired by this guy, Jacques Camat, who actually did write that book. Bruno's version is called Leaving the World Behind. And this really strikes me, this idea of an elder, the type of person I would consider to be a refugee from the long 20th century, who's made it through these waves of excitement and revolutionary possibility, and then through eras of disappointment and also paranoia, which is what the 70s were like for people. It was a dark time for a lot of people, a lot of repression. And this person has come to now and has decided that they are no longer going to wait for the revolution to arrive, because it's not coming. And capitalism is just too supple and too changeable. And it will reinvent itself and surround us no matter what form and shape we decide to try to retreat from it. And for him, instead, the only solution is to revolutionize, or maybe at least renovate, interior life and consciousness. And like, this idea really moved me. So, I decided I'm going to write this novel that involves this man, and it's set in this place that is very beloved to me, and there's so many experiences that I've had with French farmers and their relationship to ancient history. A farmer put a tool in my hand and said, this tool is 500,000 years old, and an anthropologist from Bordeaux has confirmed this. And I looked at it and thought, what is this tool for but smashing people in the head? And so I gave that detail to my narrator. But I knew that it would involve this world of a place that is contemporary and is faced toward the future, but dealing with intrusions from the ancient past. And I turned to the ancient past and was thinking about the way in which these people who came long before us, at a moment in Europe and Asia and North Africa, when many different species of people seemed to live at the same time in nomadic formations. And either they knew the other was there or not, but they did have offspring, so there were occasions where people knew the other was there. I'm interested in how intimate sometimes it feels to project onto these people as though they are like the ur-text of us, whereas if I look at like Etruscan pottery in a museum vitrine, it feels very remote and abstract for me. So for a moment I thought about writing a book that would just be about cave people, but it was too difficult. I couldn't forego my take on contemporary reality and the textures of what it feels like to be alive right now. And also there's just so much at stake that I wanted to include in the book.
You also told me before that you took a long time to find your narrator, Sadie. Is it because she's too far from you? She's a really nasty and ugly character, but also very comical. Mm.
Yeah, so I had the region, I had a set of themes, I had a kind of story with tension, which is these people decamp from Paris and form this commune and are set on a collision course with the French police. And what I didn't have at first was a narrator. And it turns out that this is really important. You can't write a novel without one. And I went through different experiments with who she was going to be, like in terms of how far she would be from me. I'm just not really cut out for autofiction because I'm not that interested in myself. So to make her a writer, it just didn't seem like it was going to work. And also, if she's somebody who's somewhat like me in terms of her sympathy and shows up to this commune to try to find a role for herself there, which has happened. I know American people who wanted to live in the northern Corrèze with anarchists, French anarchists, and eventually sort of got wounded and left because they were always kind of excluded from things. To write a book with that narrative trajectory wouldn't have fit with what I wanted to do. I couldn't say exactly what I wanted to do, but it wasn't a book whose trajectory was a process of disillusionment. Instead, I wanted to do the reverse. I wanted to go from experience to innocence. And I wanted to go also from earth to sky. I know that those were the two axes of the book. And it took me a long time, but sometimes the most obvious thing, one is blind to it. I had watched this situation in California where an FBI agent entrapped this young man who was a friend of a friend, and he was eco-activist, and he was in love with her, and she sort of convinced him, like, building a bomb is the essential component of our courtship, like, you will sleep with me after we do this, basically. And he was arrested, charged, convicted, and sentenced to 21 years in federal prison. And this guy was really young. He was like, 20-year-old kid. He served 9 years in federal prison, and then his lawyer was able to establish that this woman absolutely entrapped him. And when the judge saw the evidence, which the lawyer got through a Freedom of Information Act, he was set free that day from the courtroom. And I kept asking myself, like, what kind of person, like this FBI agent, does this? Because they aren't a reactionary that has an ideological motivation. Instead, they themselves are producing the possibility of political violence. And so, it was years of experimentation. And then when I wrote the first line of the book, I realized, oh, there's somebody reading Bruno's emails, and she's reporting on what he's saying. Well, how does she have access to his email? And it was like, by the third page, I realized she has hacked into this account. She's on her way to the, Guyenne is the name of the region, but I made that up, except that it is a name from the Ancien Regime for the lower Aquitaine, so it kind of gives French readers a clue to where it's set. But I realized she's on her way to the Guyenne to try to get these people raided by the police. She's on her way there to destroy their lives. And it was almost like the dissonant horn section of the symphony went like, ah, because I realized that a devil had entered my narrative. And the devil was this narrator. And whether or not she answers the question of what kind of person becomes an agent provocateur, she fills out the portrait for me of that type. And her beliefs are a kind of lack of beliefs. Nothing is sacred to her. She quotes Ecclesiastes, which to me is the most kind of brutal and oblique and dark component of the Old Testament. And I think she's telling herself that nothing is sacred because she is behaving as though nothing matters. She drinks quite heavily. She brags to the reader that she's a better driver while drunk, which should give the reader a clue to the distance between the author and the narrator. I didn't do anything, I swear. Maybe I did do something. I'll put that there. And finally, she says that she has no reason ever to clean up her trash because she won't be returning to the same place twice. And when she said that, it was when I realized that she's a very ontologically fragile person, because risking seeming sentimental, it is care that like holds us in place, feeling like I'm not just motivated by greed and by desire and by my superego. Like, I want to be a good person. And this is a very guiding and calibrating and stabilizing set of desires to have. And if you don't have those, life could be so bleak. So over the course of the book, it was fun to have her blunt sense of humor at first, and then it was satisfying to see whether she would become vulnerable to the teachings of Bruno, perhaps not because she's a good person, but because of proximity alone, to be so close to someone's email by reading it. Maybe it starts to occupy you. It starts to take up residence inside you.
Would you say also that Sadie is one of the faces, one of the cynical faces of the United States, or is it too simple?
Oh, well, I mean, she is American, but so am I. I mean, she has a line at one point in the book where she says she misses the violence, stupidity, and freedom of the United States. And, you know, like among my French friends, I think they do consider the United States a place that's like, you know, full of like freedom ideology and also violence and stupidity, but they also admire it a great deal. There's something about this dynamic energy that you find there, but also an absolutely savage individualism. And like when I spend a lot of time in Paris, you know, I prefer la France profonde, but when I spend time in Paris, I feel like I come up against the edges of my own individualism and savagery. Like, Americans don't have any component of the state inside of them. And I think that French people probably do. But, you know, she's a hyperbolic example of a type of American, but are most Americans undercover cops whose objective is to destroy other people's lives? No, not at all. So she's unique.
The question of political action is at the center of this novel, like it was in a different way in the Flamethrowers. Why are you so interested by the way people, especially young people, are looking for political action?
Well, yeah, I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I can see that there is a link among all of my novels, you know, like the first one is about sort of Americans in Cuba before the revolution at a moment historically when there were, you know, decolonization movements the world over, and this was just one, and I had a personal tie to it because my grandparents lived in Cuba and my mother and her sisters grew up there in the years before the revolution, and in an area where Fidel and Raul Castro also grew up, but were excluded from this quasi-colonial world that the Americans had there. And then the Flamethrowers sort of deals with some leftist politics in Italy, and I was exposed to people who were involved in that era and had amazing anecdotes and accounts of it, and I realized nobody really had written a novel about that era, and so I just felt like it was up to me to do it. And I was interested in the 70s. I'm a child of the 70s, so that's not a historical novel for me. It's, you know, my homage to an era that I witnessed, even if I witnessed it as a child. This book, I don't know, I mean, is write what you know to some degree, but also I think that for a lot of people, the project of finding a way to live that is equal to what does feel so blessed about the luck of being here is a project manqué, if you will, you know? And there are different ways of trying to go about living in a way that people feel is more true to a sense of equality, one person to the next, an escape from a sort of more predacious marketplace. And I'm touched by those experiments, but I'm also familiar with the challenges that people face when they try these things. You know, there's like a scene in the book where Sadie is pointing out that the commune is very hypocritical because they have collective daycare, but it's only the women whose own children need watching who are there working in the collective daycare. And people have said to me, oh, this is such a cynical portrait of a group of radical activists who form a commune. But to me, it isn't at all. It's simply evidence that this is a world I know very well, and I've been in the collective daycare, and the women are pissed off, but they're still there, you know, and these are challenges that people face, like the gendered division of labor does reassert itself in the commune form, and this is sort of one of the questions that gets asked. But also, my own childhood, I was raised by hippies in a very nonconformist sort of environment, and there's a scene in the book where she's asking Pascal about this boy who's jumping off of a rock into the river, He has a kind of unusual charisma. He sort of, you know, has a glossiness to him. And he says, well, we had to ask this boy to leave. He was in our school that we formed, modeled on an English pedagogy. And that's like a hint that it's modeled on this pedagogy called Summerhill. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Summerhill. It was an English style of education. I believe it's illegal now. But I went to a school that was modeled on Summerhill, and it was like totally wild. Anything goes, not good for everyone. It was fine for me. He says, you know, we had to ask this boy to leave the school that we organized because he impregnated his teacher. And, you know, that didn't happen in my school, but I realized I need to play with and have fun with this kind of social experimentation because I myself am the product of it. In fact, my mother was the teacher and my father was the student. I'm just kidding.
You just said that Bruno Lacombe was a friend of Guy Debord. Is this novel also a way to question the May 68's legacy?
Not really, no. Not to question, but actually to preserve, you know? It's kind of unusual for a lot of that history to be found in novels. And I care about it immensely. To me, the voice of Guy Debord is strangely a kind of eternal voice. Like, it cuts through the sediment of time for me when I watch Society of the Spectacle, or when I read that book, or this book he wrote in the 1980s, Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. Sexy title, I know. I feel like there's something about Guy Debord that's very strong. He just had this really rare charisma. And it just so happens that there are younger people who are still influenced by the charisma of Guy Debord. The tragedy of Debord was that he did not change the world. He merely became famous, which is what Bruno says about him. You know, or Sadie when she's summarizing what's in her dossier about Debord. There was somebody who was in the Situationists International with Debord, and prior to that, in the Lettres International with Debord, was a guy named Jean-Michel Monsillon, who I borrowed some biographical details from his life for Bruno's earliest infancy. He's a more classical character for me than Sadie in the sense that he has a deep childhood, and he talks about his primal scene, losing his family in World War II. His mother was Jewish and they all disappeared to the concentration camps. And this is also true of this real person, Monsillon, who wrote a memoir that I had read probably 15 years ago. And it's a very mysterious book to me. Very simple, very rudimentary. I think it was just an oral history he gave that somebody transcribed. And it's like he's recalling this deep past of being an orphan and washing up on the streets of Paris in the 1950s and starting to steal bottles of wine from the cellar at the Brasserie Lippe, you know, and drinking on the street with the other delinquents and helping the girls to escape from the orphanages. And they meet Guy Debord, who's very interested in the art of delinquency. And they're kind of interested in Debord because he's mysterious, he's sort of a bourgeois, he's engaged to be married, you know, and has a car and comes and goes. And it's like this exchange of information, of the art of living as though nothing matters to you. Like these people are free because they have nothing. And Debord, who sort of teaches them that they are political subjects. And this text totally fascinated me. And, you know, I borrowed elements of it to give to Bruno. And it just felt right to me that somebody who had made his way through, as I put it, the long 20th century would have made contact with Debord, who was a very important thinker of May of 1968, and has managed to survive and make it to now and still has a sense of optimism and a really powerful gentleness. Bruno has. So no, I don't think it's critical at all of that era. It's just trying to think, like, where do we go now? What's next?
Yeah, Bruno, he has a wonderful gentleness, almost like a priest.
Yeah, I think he is kind of like a priest. I mean, if you don't appreciate this like style of pontificating, you know, my book might not be for you. But there's a section of it that's called Priest Valley, which is a real place in California that I pass through now and again, population zero. And Sadie tells the Moulinard, the young anarchist, that's where she's from. You know, it's just her way of having a past and a background. I almost called the novel Priest Valley at one point because there are various priests in the book. Pascal kind of positions himself like a priest. He draws from the philosophy of this thinker. It's Dumézil or Dumézil, who had this belief that society should be divided into a tripartite structure of priest, peasant, and warrior. And Pascal quotes it, of course, positioning himself as the priest because he's not the peasant who does the farming and he's not the warrior who risks himself and gets a record or gets arrested. But Bruno is more like the real priest. I mean, at least I would say that he has a congregation of one. And that one is the narrator, Sadie.
What is also very interesting is your novel is that you're not only quoting Guy Debord and his group, you're also quoting several French writers which are really different from this group. I mean Céline, Patrick Manchette, even Michel Houellebecq, but not in this name. Why did you want to quote and to make exist this kind of French writers?
Well, so, you know, the book is set roughly in 2013. It didn't matter so much what year it was, but I wanted it to be contiguous with the era in which, for instance, Tarnac was raided by the French police, which was late 2008. But also to, you know, to be kind of be between then and now so that it would feel more or less like now. But Sadie is in Marseille at one point, and I realized, oh, it's like the first time I went to Marseille, which was 2013, and the song Get Lucky by Daft Punk was just absolutely everywhere. So that's a sort of clue that it's 2013. And I figured Michel Houellebecq would have been working on his novel Serotonin, which is a very funny novel that I appreciate a lot. But when it came out, you know, it features a scene involving a pitched battle between very angry dairy farmers, struggling dairy farmers, and French police. And I knew that, you know, I was trying to write a novel that would feature a scene of struggling dairy farmers in a pitched battle with police. And I thought, you know, Houellebecq beat me to the punch. And so then I thought the solution to that was just to put him in the book. And I figured he'd be researching and writing that novel. So to have a French living writer cross through the frame of the book and cameo, it makes more sense to me than having like Jonathan Franzen walk through the frame of the book. You know, it's a French novel, why not put, and when you say, you know, the most famous French writer, people will know, I chose to use his birth name. I don't know, I just thought it softens things a little bit, Michel Thomas. But French people will know, you know, who it is. Céline, I was reading this biography of Céline by Frédéric Vitou when I was writing the book. And there's a certain kind of French country house, like, you know, bourgeois people, but who sort of leave everything slightly a mess. And there's like weird plates and like cracked cups that somebody has glued back together in the closets, you know. This is almost like a mark of a very high family if things aren't too tidy, you know. Middle-class people live as though the Ring camera is pointing into the house. Whereas rich people are like, yes, this couch, the stuffing is falling out of it, et cetera. And I imagined that there would be like a sort of water-stained, half-ruined copy of this Frédéric Vitou biography of Céline in the house. because I thought it would be funny for her to read a few pages. Sadie considers herself to be lucky, and in the cruel sense of the word lucky, by which I mean to say she thinks that she is luckier than other people. You know, if there's luck in the room, she's the one who's going to get it. She's the one who will see weakness in other people that they themselves can't see. Good things will happen for her, not because she's a good person. You know, she quotes Ecclesiastes, who says bad things will happen to good people, and good things will happen for bad people. But she starts to notice that Celine, like her, is also very lucky. And in fact, he was really lucky. Like, there is just scene after scene in that book. He gets on a boat, the boat plows into another boat, the other boat explodes and sinks, and his just keeps going. You know, I mean, he didn't end up at Nuremberg. You know, he escapes, then he finds a sanctuary at Sigmaringen Castle. It's like, Celine, he just managed to have luck. So it's just, I don't know, it's just having fun, including texts that seemed pertinent to her character and to the theme. She's an educated person who, you know, was in a graduate program in rhetoric. And sometimes these people who end up working in intelligence agencies do come directly out of graduate programs. So it wasn't unrealistic. Manchette, I don't mention inside the book, but I was inspired by Manchette, or given maybe my own permission by reading Manchette to borrow some of the power of the noir. I never really had a very active narrator like this, because I write in a realistic vein. And, you know, people aren't often manipulating others and putting plans in their heads and guns in their hands. But in a Manchette novel, this is happening constantly. And I thought, if I have a narrator who happens to be a spy, an undercover agent, and then I want to borrow from Manchette in order to build toward what I think of as the full-blown fiasco at which he is so talented, and all of his books sort of feature that. So I'm influenced by him, but he's sort of only, you know, hopefully his spirit is in the book, or something from that, some trace.
Je ne vais pas réquisitionner toutes les questions. Je vous laisse la parole si vous avez...
I'm going to give you the floor in case you've got questions for Rachel Kushner. Rachel Kushner does speak French. Yes, a little bit. So don't hesitate to ask questions in French, but do wait until Natalia gives you a microphone before you put your questions to Rachel. And do ask your questions slowly for me, please.
Madame.
Vous avez mentionné...
You mentioned that you did quite a lot of work before you found, I don't know how you put it, but before you found the momentum for your novel. How long did it take you to write this particular novel?
Yeah.
Combien de temps ça m'a pris? Eh bien, ça me prend généralement environ 5 ans pour écrire un livre. En l'occurrence, ça a été 6, mais entre-temps, j'ai publié une collection d'essais, donc pour moi, c'est 5. Sur ces 5 ans,
of trying and experimenting and not feeling like I had this narrator, you know, as I was describing. And then when she came into the picture, I wrote the whole novel in 14 months. And it was like very long days, starting to work at 5 a.m. and like writing for 14 or 16 hours, kind of like a manic obsession. I never had that experience before like that. It was really fun. It probably shaved years off of my life. But guess which years?
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question? Ah, oui.
Other questions?
Bien, madame, tout d'abord, merci.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your novels. I didn't read the last one, but I did read others. You said that you were not very much interested in yourself, but your main characters do have a personality and an outstanding life. How do you reconcile this contradiction? How can you speak on behalf of characters who are not interested in themselves but are representatives of others in society? And then my second question is the following. What about what's going to happen starting on Monday? I'm asking the American novelist.
Thank you for both those questions. Well, you know, the trick of fiction is that the writer creates all the characters in the book, right? But I would say if I had to pick somebody I was close to, it's my character Bruno Lacombe, although I'm not really a priestly personage, but I have a sense that life is really like holy the way that he does. And Sadie doesn't believe that at all. So in that one stark sense, I'm closer to him. With her, there were times at which I would just keep positioning her like almost like in my rifle sights, 180 degrees from me. So, you know, she describes herself as banally beautiful. You know, that's not me. Like, I have some idiosyncrasies that I try to work, you know. It's where you deviate, you know what I mean? You try to maximize. And she uses her beauty as a kind of tool to manipulate other people, and her body as well. She has fake breasts. Many people do. That's completely fine. But I've noticed with friends who've gotten breast augmentations that it's like their breasts are no longer really theirs. It's really kind of interesting and cool. They're sort of like a public service, you know, like, do you want to see my tits? You know, because I think it's a process of leaving the starkness of nakedness behind and entering instead the more luminous domain of nudity, you know? So Sadie is nude and never naked. And I'm not like that at all. I'm naked right now, you know? So she's very different than I am. And also I'm always sort of, whether I fail at it or not, I'm always trying to gauge my own behavior based on what I see in other people to see if I can modify my behavior to please them a little more. And she's not like that at all. She's like this tank. It was like driving a military tank. You know, she smells weakness in other people. I mean, she's overconfident in her calculations of herself, which comes through later in the book. But even in little ways, like she sort of gloats about those who are subject to allergic reactions to mosquitoes, because the fake boyfriend that she's manipulated in order to get close to the commune is complaining about being bitten by mosquitoes, and she thinks it's like a character flaw. And I'm like that. If there's a mosquito in the room, I'll just have lumps all over my face eventually. So it was always a matter of kind of giving her this kind of armor and toughness and a lack of care for other people that I am burdened by, but somewhat happily, that she is free of, and maybe somewhat unhappily, I don't know. And so there's this line early in the book where she's transposing Bruno's emails, and he says of our contemporary reality that we are speeding toward extinction in a shiny driverless car, and the question is, how do we exit this car? And a lot of the book is him sort of trying to think his way to an answer to that, how to exit the car. It doesn't have an easy answer, because as Sadie mockingly says, if we exit the car, what do we exit besides reality? And maybe now even more so, you know, we are in a shiny driverless car speeding toward extinction, not only because of Trump and Elon Musk and the fact that my beautiful, blessed home city of Los Angeles, you know, caught on fire 2 weeks ago. But about Trump, I don't really know. That was your question, right, about Trump? I don't really know what to say or what the future holds. I don't rush in with, as we say, you know, hot takes about politics. But I did notice over the last several years that a kind of movement had formed on the left before behind this senator from Vermont named Bernie Sanders. And he had found a way to speak to people who feel excluded from the political process. And I feel like the Democratic Party excluded him from the process and told their own voters, never mind you and your concerns. If you don't vote for us, you're going to have Trump. And this is our last chance to save democracy. But the Democratic Party had faced terrible de-alignment from its own base and no longer has a base. Like I was thinking today, the way that the Socialist Party collapsed in France, that won't really happen because we don't have a runoff structure. There's only the two parties. So we're stuck with these people, and they stuck us with Trump, and I do partly blame them, and we just see what happens, but hard times are coming for sure.
Peut-être une dernière question. Oui, monsieur.
Maybe one last question?
Thank you very much for your your speaks, and I was quite stricken by your idea of these historical sediments intermingling and in a chaotic ways. And coming back to the further question, to the last question, would you be interested to try to describe the present process in US as an example of this chaos of sedimentic, historical sediments crossing each other, intermingling each other, and because for us it's a kind of a understandable thing.
Do you mean in terms of like the prehistoric history that is there in the landscape of the U.S. and Alaska? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, but perhaps making a move or a shift to the present situation, but trying to highlight it with some background.
The present political situation? Yeah, well, I haven't thought about that. I mean, there is a difference, you know, because the people who flourished in the territory that's now the United States, you know, were eradicated by the settlers who arrived there. I think that people came much earlier than was previously understood, and that is really interesting. I don't know, it's not something that I've thought about. I mean, history is so palpable to me in a place like France. Like, I walk on this path next to the Vézère River, and you can feel that it's, like I was told that the postman used this path for 200 years. But before that, you're walking under a limestone shelf, and these were people's rooms 30,000 years ago, and you can see the notches in the rock where they would hang animal skins, and there is just this feeling of ancient history being there all the time. I've always been moved by the figure that we call in America Sasquatch. In Europe, they have different forms of this, or, you know, Eastern Europe more, and the former Soviet Union of the Yeti, the snowman. And I think part of what interests me about this figure is it's an idea of a relic from an ancient, better world who has managed to evade the dominant reality. And I always pictured Sasquatch running, because you have to remain running to remain in, you know, in flight from our reality. And it seemed incredibly lonely. And like as a child, I would worry about Sasquatch. And I don't want to meet him, but I hope that he continues to exist. That's my answer.
It's maybe a wonderful ending. Thank you very much, Rachel, for this
Thank you, Oriane. Thank you all. Thanks for your questions.
Pour le programme suivant, il y a une veilleille.
We now offer you a drink upstairs, and Rachel Kushner is going to be signing her books also on the ground floor. Thank you.